Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Just so you know, we do have a Instagram now, so you can keep posted on what we are doing and what we are reading of the week or the month. Anyways, today we are going to be reading Untangle Your Anxiety by Joshua Fletcher and Dean Scott. Chapter 5. Anxiety is a threat response. Featured artist is @CrazyHeadComics. And we'll start adding the pictures on our Instagram. We think it is really helpful to describe anxiety as a threat response when it comes to learning about anxiety and overcoming it. To put it simply, an excessive anxiety problem is when our threat response misfires at times when we don't want it to. Also, and perhaps most importantly, disordered anxiety occurs when our threat response is triggered after it has unintentionally conditioned to. For example, many people with a panic disorder have an amygdala that has been conditioned to trigger at the first sign of panic, such as shortness of breath, derealization, dizziness, palpitations, etc. This also applies to social anxiety, where our amygdala can be triggered by people, or even agoraphobia, where our threat response can be triggered by even the thought of going outside. You are not broken. A common belief that people with anxiety often describe to is the belief that they are in some way broken. This is simply not true, and we will explain why. Anxious thoughts and vivid imaginations are exactly signs of intelligence. They form part of our rationalization process, which is the brain scans through all the potential scenarios of their sequences. For example, before we attempt to cross the road, it is helpful to imagine that we may be struck by a moving vehicle, as it would influence us to look in both directions before stepping out. Similarly, we may be tempted to cut through a park at night, only to avoid it because of some suspicious-looking people hanging out in the shadows. The thought of being assaulted may actually keep us safe by influencing our decisions to take a safer walk home. Unfortunately, this influencing process can become entangled in our day-to-day lives, and our brains can start to figure out the worst-case scenarios of situations where we categorically safe. When the threat response triggers, this engages the mind to scan the situation and provide all the potential dangers that could occur. This is why people have health anxiety suddenly believe that a headache could suddenly be a brain tumor, or heart palpitations could be the sign of heart failure. Similarly, people who panic misinterpret normal signs of fight, flight, or freeze, or first steps towards insanity or losing control. It is the threat response that triggers the rationalization process when it simply isn't needed. The person with social anxiety suddenly misinterprets a facial expression as the sign of rejection, or the person with GAD thinks that the email from their boss is to summon them to a meeting where they will be fired. We must also remember that our amygdala misfires. It also creates the feelings and sensations that come with fight, flight, or freeze response. This adds an extra layer to anxious suffering and provides a mental lens to suddenly make our thoughts feel a bit more real. We don't react emotionally to the vast majority of our thoughts, but if our threat response has been triggered and we are experiencing the effects of adrenaline and cortisol, when suddenly this can magnify the intensity of scary thoughts. For example, on a calm morning, we can imagine weird thoughts such as, what if I go insane? And they don't seem to affect us. However, the same thought can appear and feel terrifying if the threat response has been triggered. You must remember that just because your threat response has been triggered, this does not mean that you are broken in any way. Excessive anxiety is a condition which by its definition means that it can be changed to an alternate state. Just because your amygdala and threat response are misfiring and you're dealing with lots of adrenaline does not mean you are permanently ill. You will recover, and you can recover. Overcoming anxiety is turning off the threat response. In simple terms, overcoming an anxiety condition is when we successfully manage to turn off the threat response during times when we do not need it. You must remember that anxiety cannot be completely eradicated. It is a normal, essential, and healthy function of our minds and bodies. We need the threat response to live. It is extremely helpful to have It is extremely helpful and has probably saved our lives countless times in the past, but over time we meet it with no gratitude as we undoubtedly start to resent it when we live each day with it unnecessarily. When Josh works with anxious clients at the panic room and asks them what they would like to get from therapy, he often hears statements like, I just want to feel like normal self again, and I just want to stop feeling like this. Is, in essence, what these clients are actually representing is, I would like to turn off my body's threat system. It is scary and uncomfortable. We really hope you join us in our conceptualization of anxiety being a threat response. All that fear, uncertainty, racing thoughts, physical symptoms, apprehensions, catastrophic-based beliefs are monitoring are all part of the same response. We're looking at the neurobiology of this threat response. It is really important to understand how we can interact with the amygdala in order to switch it off. We cannot, however, control the amygdala ourselves, but we can heavily influence its decisions to turn the threat response on and off. Ultimately, when the amygdala decides there is no danger, it switches off. This is when we stop experiencing the feelings and sensations associated with adrenaline and cortisol and return to feeling calm and normal. When we no longer feel anxious, this is when the amygdala has switched off. Importantly, we must remember that we cannot talk to the threat response. Words mean nothing to it. This is because the amygdala is only wired to our thinking brains in one direction, meaning that the amygdala can send signals to our thinking brain, but we are unable to send information back to it. This is why talking to your anxiety doesn't really work. Think about it. How many times have you tried to talk yourself down or tell the anxiety to go away, or even use words to convince yourself it doesn't work for this very reason? However, what does work is when we show the amygdala using our senses by facing fear or what the amygdala defines as danger, we can actively begin to turn off the anxious response so that it is triggered in the future. We can begin to live our normal lives again. This does require being a bit courageous, but you will be being so in the knowledge that you are saved. The purpose of the threat response. Have you ever wondered why you feel on edge a lot? Feeling on edge is like a mild form of a threat response. When we feel on edge, our attention is usually heightened and we're hyper alert like a meerkat. As our senses sharpen, our thoughts become more detailed and more dangerous. When we become hyper-vigilant, but what's the purpose of that? Our friend, our meerkat, needs this hyper-vigilance so that he can flee from the approaching jackal or stick up for his fists if he's feeling that brave. But what has got to do with us sitting at home, feeling on edge as the Wi-Fi fails to work during the important business meeting held online? In day-to-day life, what's the point of it? To greater understand the purpose of this threat response, we must understand it biologically. We need to take a look at two important hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. Although both of the hormones play an extremely important role in the threat response, we will primarily focus on cortisol to help us understand it from a biological standpoint. Cortisol is a hormone that we call the stress hormone. It is released from the adrenal gland, the same place that releases adrenaline. If we're calling this the stress hormone, we might sit there and wonder, what is the purpose of releasing cortisol when I'm trying to eat my bowl of Weetabix in the morning? We should feel comfortable in times like these when we're simply moving through our daily routines. So, what's the purpose of releasing cortisol when we're not in any immediate danger? Let's take a look. When we're stressed in our minds and bodies, we can easily get confused and perceive that we are under threat. Yet, it is when we are under immediate threat that we release the hormone adrenaline. Adrenaline is what gives us a boost of energy to make us feel as though we can wrestle with bears and at least outrun them despite never having run a yard in our lives. When adrenaline kicks in, we take immediate action, whether that be defending ourselves, fight, or fleeing the scene, flight. If a predator comes after you, it's the adrenaline that you'll need. However, we've only limited amounts of hormones, so if we're walking around in our day-to-day lives using up all of our adrenaline, what's going to happen when the bear wanders around the corner and we suddenly need to take action? We run out of adrenaline, so we can't fight back and we can't run either. Luckily, there is a middleman, and the middleman is cortisol. Where cortisol is concerned, we have more of it. When this cortisol runs through our bodies, we can stay in half threat, half normal mode, which is where the sensation of feeling on edge comes into play. You still have function, but you don't necessarily feel relaxed. This is cortisol. Cortisol keeps us in the state of high alert so that we do find ourselves under threat. We can quickly engage with adrenaline when we need it. Picture this scene. We're back on the plains of thousands of years ago, and there are predators everywhere. Imagine lions, hyenas, and cheetahs roaming in every direction. Cortisol is the instinct in keeping us on high alert. This is really important in this scenario because as humans, we're going to do a pretty terrible job when face to face with a lion. We can't fight it, and we can't run away from it. The likes of Usain Bolt could give it a good go, but even his superhuman speed is unlikely to save him. So, what's the point? Cortisol helps us maintain the state of high alert, which is crucial to our survival in the scenario, because what street hormone does is allow us to see the predator coming. We don't want to wait until it is right on top of us to trigger the threat response. In these conditions, we want to remain extra vigilant so that we can mitigate risk and avoid danger. Cortisol, in effect, has saved our lives in advance by making us aware that what is going on around us. Perhaps we hear a rustle in the trees and wisely decide to steer clear, which in turn could keep us safe. We might think there is a noise among those trees. I don't know what it could be, but it might be a predator. I'm not going to aimlessly walk among the growth and into a potentially dangerous situation. Better keep away. This is thanks to cortisol. Of course, cortisol is great if you find yourself in the sangria yet and threat response gets confused because in day-to-day life we are looking for predators and aren't there. The reason it benefits to understand the cortisol is how it functions within our threat responses so we don't engage with it. If we have cortisol running through our bodies and we entertain it, we might sit there in an otherwise safe environment and think to ourselves, what if they think I'm ridiculous? Or what if I throw up in front of everyone? Or what if? It's what if. It's an incredible waste of our energy and could be far better used somewhere else. We get caught up thinking that these messages are real in our daily lives, but they are not real messages. For example, if you have social anxiety, you're worrying about a party 2 weeks in advance, or you have an appraisal due from work that you're fixating on, then that is the prime example of living in a state of high alert. You might ruminate, what if they say that, or what if that does happen, or when we listen to it, we keep the stress response on when it doesn't need to be. In turn, the only perpetuates our stress surrounding the situation. In the modern day, our stress response tries to apply itself to modern things and that's where we get confused. It's quicker to engage in fight or flight if you're already half in it, making it quicker and easier for the adrenaline to kick in and help us flee before anything really bad happens. In reality, the dangers we face in everyday life aren't real dangers. Nothing really bad is likely to happen. Consider this. Have you ever watched a scary movie that has left you feeling on edge, only for your partner to touch your arm afterward and jump on you out of your skin? This is the exact same thing. The cortisol is keeping you in a state of high alert so that the adrenaline is in easy reach when it's needed. So what is the purpose of the threat response? It can save us in advance. Quite frankly, we're not great at fighting and we're not great at running. So it's there to help us avoid having to do either of these things, conserving our adrenaline but not allowing us to relax. If we're in a sangria or could truly appreciate the biology and necessity for this cortisol response. In conversation, Josh, What really interests me, Dean, was the different rules of the anxious chemicals. So I don't know for ages, but cortisol is what keeps us on edge. And that's because, if we're on the Serengeti and we're looking for predators, we can't fight or run from a lion because we're rubbish at it. But the cortisol helps us keep us on edge so that we can see them coming from a mile away. This is the exact same response that we have now. Annoyingly, we don't need cortisol to see our annoying boss coming from a mile away. We don't need cortisol to anticipate an email coming in to threaten us. But also, the role of adrenaline when that perceived danger actually appears like bam. And that's suddenly when we feel the terror, the fear, the oh my gosh, something bad is going to happen, the racing heart, and the immense doom. And I just thought it was really interesting because as a threat response, it makes sense. I can see that making sense hundreds and thousands of years ago. It's just quite difficult to get our head around now. Do you see any positives in having the threat response now? Dean, it all depends on the situation because obviously anxiety gets a bad rep, but it's what makes us safe in situations, so anxiety is obviously still needed in certain situations, which, do you know what I mean? Could be life-threatening. So, if you could think about it, if we didn't have it, we'd be wandering around carefree. Josh, just walking into traffic. Dean, yeah, you need that rush to almost, make your reactions, go super quick so you don't get run over. Josh, I can imagine socially as well. You don't want to go up to the biggest, toughest person and you just say what you think. You need anxiety to shut you up. Dean, yeah, 100%. Josh, your haircut's really offensive. Oops, run. Dean, but sat in the office and having a rush of these strong chemicals is where the downside can be because, yeah, it's just an intense feeling and almost like when someone has an espresso coffee. That feeling of the increased heart rate almost mimics the anxiety response, doesn't it? So I suppose being sat in the office and having this rush of chemicals, it can obviously be very scary.